Today, kind of an overview of what we're going to talk about. First, we're going to discuss how dynamic pop-ups bring added value to your end users when you're creating web maps and apps for them. And we're going to start off by looking at some examples, kind of the end product. Then we'll look at creating dynamic pop-ups and how we can, first of all, first we'll look at adding photos to our pop-ups. We'll look at then custom URL links, so linking to a web page or features there that are referenced on a web page. And then last, we will look at custom URL parameters, which is a really powerful tool that Esri has available in their URL parameters for their web app builder, as well as dashboards. And then finally, we'll finish up with any questions at the end. So certainly, as we go throughout the session, like Bill, I believe, mentioned, put your questions in the pop-up box. We'll make sure or in the chat box. We'll try to get to those. So dynamic pop-ups, we want to deliver value, added value to our web maps and apps. Referencing photos is one way to do that. So I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, so I want to look at a couple examples here of how we can bring added value. So this here is a cemetery map, very large cemetery here in Peoria, Illinois, that we helped them create, basically map all of their grave sites and then build some interaction to their web map. This is a public search web map here that is pulling data as they update the graves and grave information. And so I want to look at, there is a HODL here in this cemetery. So as we zoom in, what we can see here is my pop-up box comes up from my search results. And in this case, let me find, we've got some here. As you see, we have a find a grave link, and I want to be able to pull up information from both find a grave as well as the direction. So here's a good example here if we zoom in a little bit. This particular burial, Miss Brady, we have a link here to the Find a Grave website. And if I click on this link in my pop-up box, you're going to see that that opens her information on Find a Grave. Now, the beauty of this is I did not have to go in and copy and code every one of these URLs into all 70,000 graves. I would be, I don't know how long that would take me, but I don't want to do that. So we build in the pop-up box, and we can build these dynamically, which we'll look at. The other one, we have directions. Don't tell Esri necessarily, but we are using a link to Google Maps in this case, and we are using a dynamic URL there. As we click on the directions, it is going to open up the routing and directions there. We can zoom in, we can see exactly how that would route me to those roads. Again, all handled through dynamic pop-ups, okay? So one more area of the cemetery we'll look at, I'm gonna type in the name Durgis, and I believe we have a point of interest category for Durgis. And I also have a summary over here of my points of interest that I can look at, broken out by what type. But in this case, why I wanted to show Durgis is, you see, as I select the pop-up there, I have a nice looking photo here of this monument, which is kind of handy. It just really enhances the use of our pop-ups there. And if I click on Edit Feature, then that's going to take me to a web app. Of course, I need to sign in here, but it's going to take me to a web app where I can then be able to edit those features. So I will sign in, be able to edit and update. Again, because I was coming from a publicly available web app, it's nice. That's why I had to sign in there, but it takes me directly to that feature. And then, of course, I can begin my editing process there as soon as I select that. So another one I wanted to look at, an example, if we want to see how we can, so that was photos and links. Now I want to talk about how we can build in workflow and connectivity. And this is another one we want to look at, but I'm just going to show you the example here. So in this case, I have a structures dashboard, And what I want is, if I'm selecting a structure, I can click on that structure, and you'll see here's another form of a dynamic pop-up within my structures dashboard. And another way of using these is through a workflow where I can edit the structure. So in this case, if I click on edit structure, and then of course I will need to sign in again here, because again, I'm going from a publicly accessible map to a private. And then if I select that structure, it opens up my editor right here. And as I edit this information, it's going to be reflected in real time in the maps. So let's get into a little bit more of how we're accomplishing this and how do we build these. So just kind of at a high level, we're using ArcGIS.com, ArcGIS Online is what we're familiar with. Many of you are probably familiar with this. ArcGIS Online is, in this case, to make these dynamic pop-ups, we need, number one, we need a feature layer. We need a feature layer that's published to our ArcGIS Online account. Then we also need a web map in order to access those layers and build that web map. And then we could do dynamic pop-ups straight from a web map, but to really enhance the user experience, that's where we want to do either web apps or story maps, or in this case, dashboards. We'll take a look at those. So that's kind of it at a high level on what we'll touch on here. So first, I want to look at the photos. How do we make this happen with the photos and being able to have those show up in our pop-up boxes? Well, I will tell you, the photos showing up as if you have attachments. I think most of us are familiar with how to add attachments. In this case, if we let's go ahead and we can edit. I don't know if I have my editing enabled for this one. Let's toggle our other layer on here. So I have my edit, and then I can come down, I can choose a file, and then I can add an attachment. So we'll just choose a small logo here. And now we have that uploaded as an attachment. But how do I get these attachments to show up in a pop-up box? So that's what I have here. So there's some tricks to this, and there is some, it can be a little bit of a pain to accomplish this, but I want to explain some of the pros and cons, I guess, with doing this. One is, and I'm going to go ahead and post a wonderful article in the chat box here. So I can do that. Let's see. Bill, I'll tell you what, I'm going to send that to you and let you post in the chat box, if that's all right. Okay.
Yep, not a problem.
All right. So basically, though, it's not a perfect workflow here as we want to enable our attachments to show up in our pop-ups. It does require some field calculating in between, but and it also is limited to the first attachment, at least for what I'm going to show you here, for all intents and purposes. So what I sent in the chat box is going to be a great article that kind of describes this process. But the workflow is, okay, so say this is my drop box, or excuse me, not my drop boxes, but my curb stops. And let's say this is what I want to enable those attachments to be able to be shown on. So first I have to create a view layer. So if we look at the item details, if you want to create a view layer is a layer that we can make publicly available. We don't have to worry about folks editing behind the scenes, and that's just kind of best practice. So we would do create view layer, and then that then would not allow editing for that layer. And as you make changes to your layer, those would then be reflected into the view layer. Just kind of think of it as a read-only or view-only layer. So that's what I've done here. I've already created that view layer, and I'm calling it public. Okay, so I have that pulled into my map already. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that I can enable attachments. If I don't have attachments enabled with those, then you can see there's a, let's go here. If I go to my layers here and I click on that layer, there's a toggle button here where I would then enable attachments. So that's important. We have to be able to have that in order to attach photos to our features. But going back here, then the layer is shared publicly. And then I also have to, in order to do this, I want to add some of those custom fields. Okay. So I'm going to go again to my item details. I go to data, and I'm going to look at my table here. And I've already added these custom fields. The two fields I'm after are attach ID, and that's an integer, and then also count attachments. That's another integer field. Okay. So in order, the process that I would do is, let's say I just added a bunch of photos as attachments to this layer, and I really want them to be able to show up in my public web map. The process I'm going to go through is, first of all, I'm going to do a field calculation on the count attachments, and it's going to be an arcade expression. And in this case, I'm just going to run a simple arcade expression here. Let me bring this over and we will paste it in. Okay, it's called count attachments. Very simple. It's just going to count the attachments that are belonging to each feature. So you'll see, you'll get this calculation screen here. It's running the field calculation. Again, all through ArcGIS Online on the cloud. You may have done field calculations in ArcGIS Pro or ArcMap. However, now we're doing it just in the ArcGIS Online environment. So now that I've calculated those fields, now what I want to do, and this is just a, kind of one of the workflows or part of the workflow that, it can be a little clunky, but it is necessary to go through this. Now I need to run a filter on my layer. So I went to visualization. And what I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to add a filter, add an expression, and I'm going to filter my, let me find it here, count attachments is greater than 0. Okay. And I'm going to apply that filter. And if we now save that layer temporarily, I'm going to save it. And I'm going to go back to my data table. I've only got attachments on one feature in this case. So that's what I had to do, that filter, in order to do my next step. Okay, the next step I'm going to do is we're going to do this another field calculation. Okay, and this time our field calculation we're going to do is going to be on the attach ID field. And I'm going to do calculate, arcade expression. Again, if I don't filter this layer first, like I showed you, then this is going to give me an error. When I run my test, it's going to give me an error. It has to be filtered to only the features that actually have attachments. So if I click OK, that then runs my field calculation on those features that have attachments. Okay. Then at this point, then I can go back, I can remove my filter after I ran that calculation. So go to our filter here, and we will remove that second one. This first one I have in just to make my data set smaller. Didn't want it to be too big. So then I'll save my layer again. Okay. Now what we're going to do, we're going to go into our web map. And here's the fun part then. Now we need to start to do something with our pop-up box. Okay, right here. This is pretty ugly right now. There's a lot going on here, and it's just not, it's not ideal. I've got this long link in there. So if we really want to kind of spruce this up a little, we can come over here and we're going to configure pop-ups. And for most of these, what I'm going to do is you have your options here. And I think by default, Esri has it say a list of field attributes. Very frequently, though, what I am going to do and what I would encourage you to do is use a custom attribute display. Okay. And when you do that, you'll get your little green button here that says configure. And we can configure our expression, or configure our pop-up box. And here I just added an expression. And how I got that in there was just use the little plus box, and I scroll down to where my expression is. I think it's toward the bottom here. There we go. And I picked the one that said attachment URL. Okay. Or I could just say John's test, because that's just the text that's going to show up in the pop-up box. What I want to do is highlight that and click the little URL link. And then here is where I want to put my, I want to put my expression. And I'll explain where we got this here in a minute. We'll do 0. Okay, that's going to be my URL. So you can see it just made a link there, and I click OK. And now if I click OK to that, now when I select my pop-up, then select my feature, now I've got John's test as the URL link, and it's pulling that URL behind is pulling from my custom data behind the pop-up, the custom pop-up here. So how did I get that expression? So this comes here where I can add an attribute expression. And this is really where all the magic happens, is with these attribute expressions here. So in this case, attachment URL, if I click on the little settings icon there, this is where I'm creating this URL, or I'm building the URL. So it's dynamic, okay? So what you're typically going to have with these attribute expressions, you're going to have a URL here, or a base URL, excuse me. So like in my find a grave example, this would have said findagrave.com ID equals, and then the rest of the URL is being populated with something from my GIS data from my layers, some sort of feature attribute that's going to be building out the rest of my URL. So in this example, that's what I'm building, that URL link that then I'm going to reference in my pop-up box. So hopefully that makes sense to folks on what we've got there so far. So in this case, I had a test just to kind of show you if it was working or not. I was having some troubles with this one, getting that to show up dynamically. Let's see if we try our other layer. That one might be referencing that. I was having a little problem getting that working so far, but from the example I showed you earlier with the cemetery, that's where you can, again, have those pop-ups be linked and those images coming in dynamically. Okay, so I want to keep moving along here for the sake of time, and I want to jump next into creating custom links. So this is what we looked at with the Find a Grave examples. So those custom links, how we create those, very similar to what we just walked through. So in this case, you remember me showing the point of interest. So let's zoom into that point of interest and let's explore what's going on here as we look at Durgis. Let's explore what we've got in this pop-up box. Okay, here's my point of interest. It says view. That's how I know it's a view only layer or a view layer. And I'm going to go configure pop-up. And then you can see I already added I have in those attribute URLs, got my information there. And then again, a custom or configure a custom pop-up. And then we can see here where I have, if I click on the code, this is, I just copied and pasted, again, a Google search where you can copy and paste the code to show an image. And then it's saying, hey, here's my image. Here's the URL for my image. And it's pulling that from over here in my attribute expressions. Okay, so that's where it's pulling those. And then I've also got edit feature showing up, which again, the edit feature, if I look here, turn off our codes, go down here, edit feature is just text, but then I have a URL, a link that's pulling expression 2, which again is over here. Expression 2 I already created. Let's go look at expression 2 and see what that looks like. So what this is doing is expression 2 is opening my editor app, and it's opening that up so I can then be able to edit the feature that I'm looking at. Okay, so if we look at the rest of that, we can say, oh, here's my URL for my editor app. Oh, and by the way, add on object ID, comma, and then the features object ID. I'm pulling this dynamically. And that's what allows my app that I'm opening to zoom right into that feature and pull that. Okay. So that's the point of interest. Now let's look at some of our, let's look at one of our grave sites here. So if we want to look at, okay, what are we doing here behind the scenes on that particular grave site? I'm going to look at my, again, on my other layer for my grave sites, configure pop-up. And here you'll see for this one, I've got a bunch of attribute expressions added in. The one for navigation we can look at, And again, this is a little bit more complex here. You can get as complex as you want with your arcade expressions, but this one is essentially pulling the latitude and longitude of the feature and then populating that with the URL to pull up the navigation link. Some of my other ones, a little bit more simpler. These other attribute expressions are formatting like date of death and date of birth. If we look at some of those, it's just pulling information from my features and it's just formatting it in the way that I want to see. And that's what we've got here at the top. It gives date of death, date of birth, or the years anyway. For my find a grave link, we'll just take a quick look at that. What does that look like? Again, we have our base URL, findagrave.com, and then it says, hey, by the way, to build this reference URL, I'm going to tack on to that base, I'm going to tack on some feature information, in this case, the find a grave ID, which the users plug in when they do the editing. Okay. And then finally, just looking at briefly, what does the URL parameters look like for our last example where we looked at the structure example. I just want to take a look at that web map. Again, this web map is behind the scenes on that structure example. And here's my pop-up. Okay, so let's look at, again, how did we build and configure that pop-up? If we go to configure pop-up, and again, a custom configuration. In this case, I have no need for attribute expressions because most of it's all handled, all of it's handled in my custom pop-up configuration. So again, all I did was type in the text here, edit structure, and then in my URL, this is where I'm referencing my other editor application. That's what this link is. And if we go to the end, I've got this and query equals structures, comma, SN. And then at the very end, I've got this SN in parentheses. That is pulling the structure number from my layer. So that's essentially what's building that dynamic URL to say, hey, open up my editor app, go to this structure, zoom to this structure, and then I simply click on that, and that's opening my editing, my smart editor widget in this case. So I'm going to stop there because it looks like we just got a few minutes left here, and I do want to leave some time for questions. I am going to go ahead, Bill, I'm going to send a couple more to you if you want to put those in the chat box. Just a couple more links. And these two links that I'm sending here, these are going to be that Bill will put in the chat box. Those will be helpful for being able to see how to build URL parameters in dashboards or web apps.
Yep.
So we can have those available to folks. So
yep, absolutely. I'm getting those in there now. We do have one question, John, while I'm doing that. Are the field calculations, are these field calculations retained as new attachments are added, or do we just rerun the calculation periodically?
Yeah, that's a great question. So unfortunately, you do need to run the field calculations after every time you add additional attributes. That is a little bit unfortunate. However, you could script it so it's automated. That's probably what I would do if I'm adding attachments on a regular basis. So I might have a script that runs monthly, weekly if I'm adding a lot of attachments. For the cemetery project I showed you, they don't add photos that often of their points of interest. So when we do, we'll just run that manually. It doesn't take too long once you get used to that.
And someone just asked if these chat links, these articles and whatnot, will be included in the recorded version of the webinar. Not sure about that, but I will follow up with all attendees, and I'll make sure and stick all these links in the email for you guys, along with a link to the recording as well, so you can make sure and follow up with that. So good question on that end. Looks like that's it for now. And we are right up on time. So folks, again, thank you so much for attending today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with some contact information for you there. And So there we go. So yeah. So again, thank you all for attending. Like I said, I will be following up with everyone with some links and the recording after we get that done and converted. But please, any more questions, any help that you guys need with anything that John went over or any of our other offerings, you can contact John or myself directly. We've got our email there on the screen. Office number 877-377-8124. Of course, we're all over social media, so you can look us up there as well. But we just want to thank you guys for attending, and we hope to see you all again real soon.
Thanks, everybody.